Picture this. You wake up on an ordinary October morning in the year 79 AD. The sun filters through your window, birds are singing, and you have absolutely no idea that in less than 12 hours you'll either be dead or one of the few who discovered the secrets I'm about to share with you. Before we dive into this incredible story of survival against impossible odds, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment and let me know which part of the world you're in. And if this story of ancient survival tactics fascinates you as much as it does me, consider subscribing. We explore the most gripping survival stories throughout history, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius wasn't just any natural disaster. It unleashed the power of 100,000 atomic bombs, sent a column of ash 30 kilometers into the sky, and buried entire cities in a matter of hours. For nearly 2,000 years, we believed everyone died. The story seemed simple. Volcano explodes, everyone perishes, end of story. But recent archaeological discoveries have shattered that narrative completely. Scientists have now traced over 200 survivors who not only escaped this apocalypse, but went on to rebuild their lives in other Roman cities. So how did they do it? What did they know that the others didn't? The answers will surprise you, and some of their strategies could save your life in any natural disaster today. 17 years before the mountain exploded, the earth itself tried to warn them. February 5, 62 AD, a massive earthquake, magnitude 5, rocked the entire Bay of Naples. Buildings crumbled, statues toppled, and the very foundations of Pompeii shook like a child's toy. But here's what's truly chilling. The Romans didn't connect this to volcanic activity. Why? Because they had convinced themselves that Vesuvius was extinct, dead, harmless. The last eruption had occurred over 300 years earlier, and memory fades fast when it comes to geological time. Yet nature kept sending signals that only a few bothered to read. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, recorded something deeply disturbing that happened after that earthquake. 600 sheep dropped dead around Vesuvius, seemingly from poisoned air. What killed them? Volcanic gases seeping from the earth. Carbon dioxide that modern volcanologists recognize as a classic warning sign of magma movement deep underground. The Romans, they shrugged it off as bad luck. Then came the smaller tremors. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero was performing in a Naples theater when the ground started shaking. According to Suetonius, Nero kept singing until he finished his song, even as the audience fled in terror. After everyone left, the theater collapsed. If that's not an ominous sign, I don't know what is. But the most eerie warnings came in the final days before the eruption. Wells across the region began running dry. The water table was literally being sucked up by the volcanic system, preparing for its explosive release. Hot springs that had flowed for generations suddenly stopped. Public baths closed because their water sources vanished. Even more bizarre were the reported sightings of giants. Ancient historian Dio Cassius wrote about witnesses seeing enormous figures, resembling titans, moving through the smoke and mist around the mountain in the days before the eruption. Whether these were optical illusions caused by volcanic gases or mass hysteria, we'll never know. But imagine the psychological terror of seeing these apparitions, while your world literally trembled beneath your feet. The truly tragic part. All of these signs were there for anyone willing to see them. Modern volcanologists tell us that Vesuvius was practically screaming its intentions. Ground deformation, gas emissions, seismic activity. It was a textbook case of volcanic awakening. But the Romans had one fatal flaw in their thinking. They trusted their recent experience over geological reality. 3 centuries of quiet had made them complacent. Sound familiar? It's the same cognitive bias that makes people build in flood zones or earthquake-prone areas today. It hasn't happened in our lifetime, so it won't happen at all. Those who survived the eruption had one thing in common. They didn't trust that false sense of security. But recognizing the signs was only the first step. The night of October 23rd to 24th, 79 AD, while most of Pompeii slept soundly, something sinister was stirring in the depths of Mount Vesuvius. The mountain had been rumbling softly for days, but that night the tremors became more insistent, more urgent. At the Villa Rustica, perched on the volcano's slopes, wealthy Romans noticed something that would chill your blood. Ash was falling like snow in front of their doors. Fresh ash, the kind that appears when a volcano is clearing its throat before screaming. But here's the terrifying detail that archaeologists discovered centuries later. There were no footprints in that ash. None, which means it fell so close to the main eruption that the inhabitants never even made it outside. They were buried in their sleep. One person who did notice was a woman named Rectina. Her villa sat somewhere along the coast, and she had enough sense to be terrified by what she was seeing. She sent an urgent message across the Bay of Naples to Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum. "Help us. Something terrible is happening." This message would seal Pliny's fate. But it also reveals something crucial about survival. The people who made it out were the ones who asked for help early. They didn't wait to see how bad things would get. They didn't convince themselves it would pass. They acted on incomplete information, and that snap decision saved their lives. Meanwhile, in Pompeii itself, life continued with deadly normalcy. In what we now call the House of the Working Painters, a crew of artists had started their day like any other. They were laying fresh plaster on a wall, preparing to create another beautiful fresco. The master painter was sketching his design, completely absorbed in his work. Then, sometime between 10 a.m. and noon, everything changed. A series of explosions echoed across the landscape. The ground shook, and a painter working on scaffolding dropped his container of lime. The white substance splattered across the wall, and 19 centuries later, archaeologists would find it exactly where it fell. A frozen moment of terror, preserved in time. But even then, most people rationalized what they were experiencing. They looked up at the small black cloud forming above Vesuvius and thought, "Storm cloud, must be thunder. Weather's been strange lately." This is where psychology becomes your deadliest enemy. The human brain is wired to find normal explanations for abnormal events. It's called normalcy bias, and it kills more people in disasters than the disasters themselves. The survivors of Vesuvius had somehow bypassed this mental trap. By early afternoon, the wealthy residents living closest to the volcano began to panic. These weren't your average citizens. They were the elite, with country estates offering them front-row seats to the unfolding catastrophe. They could see what the people in the cities below couldn't. This wasn't weather. This was something else entirely. Some of them made a decision that would save their lives. They grabbed what they could carry and ran. Not tomorrow. Not after they finished their business. Right then, in that moment of uncertainty, archaeological evidence shows us that the smart money was already moving. Stables were emptied of horses and carts. Strongboxes were cleaned out of coins and jewelry. Ships that should have been in harbor were mysteriously absent from their moorings. The wealthy survivors didn't wait for official evacuation orders that would never come. They evacuated themselves. But the most important detail, they ran in the right direction. And that choice would mean the difference between life and death. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the cork that had been blocking Vesuvius's throat for centuries finally gave way. The sound was heard across the entire Bay of Naples. A roar so deep and primal that people 30 kilometers away felt it in their bones. Within minutes, a column of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris rocketed into the sky at 300 meters per second. To put that in perspective, that's faster than the speed of sound. The column climbed higher and higher to 15 kilometers, 20, 25, finally reaching 30 kilometers into the atmosphere. From a distance, it looked exactly like what Pliny the Younger described, a massive pine tree made of smoke and fire. Now here's where survival became a matter of split-second decision-making. If you were in Pompeii at that moment, you had exactly one choice to make, and you had to make it fast. Which direction do you run? Most people's instinct would be to run away from the volcano, south, away from the terrifying mountain that was literally exploding before their eyes. This seems logical, right? Get as much distance as possible between you and the source of danger. That instinct killed thousands of people. Why? Because of the wind. The prevailing winds that day were blowing from the northwest, carrying the volcanic ash and pumice directly southeast toward anyone fleeing south. If you ran south, you were running directly into the path of destruction. You were chasing the very danger you were trying to escape. Dr. Pier Paolo Petroni, a forensic anthropologist who has studied the Vesuvius victims for decades, puts it bluntly. If you wanted to survive, you had to do the counterintuitive thing. You had to run north, toward the volcano, toward Naples, into what looked like the most dangerous direction possible. This is where the survivors showed their genius. While everyone else was fleeing in panic toward what seemed like safety, the people who lived were the ones who stopped, observed the wind direction, and made the hard choice to run toward apparent danger. Within an hour of the initial explosion, Pompeii was experiencing something no one there had ever seen before. It was raining rocks, not metaphorically, literally. Pumice stones, some as big as your fist, were falling from the sky at 150 kilometers per hour. The lighter ones, called lapilli, wouldn't kill you directly, but they were accumulating at a rate of 15 centimeters per hour. Do the math. After just 4 hours, there would be 60 centimeters of volcanic debris on the ground. After 8 hours, over a meter. Try walking through snow that deep while rocks are pelting you from above and the air is thick with ash. Every step becomes a struggle. Every breath burns your lungs. The survivors who chose the northern route had another crucial advantage. They could see where they were going. The ash cloud was being blown away from them, not toward them. While people fleeing south were stumbling blind through an increasingly dark hellscape, the northbound survivors could navigate by landmarks, avoid obstacles, and maintain their pace. But speed was everything. The volcanic debris wasn't just accumulating on the ground, it was accumulating on rooftops throughout Pompeii. Stone by stone, pound by pound, the weight was becoming unbearable. Around 8 p.m., the composition of the falling material changed from white pumice to denser gray pumice. By this point, The total accumulation had reached nearly 3 meters in some areas. The physics of survival had become brutally simple. Keep moving or get trapped. The people who paused to gather more belongings, who went back for something they forgot, who waited for family members to join them. These hesitations became death sentences. Archaeological evidence shows us exactly how this played out. Of the bodies found in Pompeii, 345 were discovered inside buildings where people had taken shelter. They thought the stone walls would protect them. Instead, they became their tombs when the roofs collapsed under the weight of volcanic debris. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even as this hell was unfolding, some people were still making it out. Even 8 hours into the eruption, with pumice piling up everywhere, a few determined souls were still successfully escaping. They had cracked the code of survival in an apocalyptic scenario. Their secret wasn't just about choosing the right direction. It was about preparation, mindset, and understanding, something that most people never grasp about disasters. While thousands panicked and died, a select few had transformed themselves into survival machines. Their tactics were so effective that some of their strategies are still used by disaster preparedness experts today. First, they understood protection. Pliny, the elder, and his companions did something that saved their lives during the first phase. They tied cushions to their heads with cloth strips. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about preventing skull fractures from falling pumice stones. The survivors had realized that your head was your most vulnerable target, and they armored it accordingly. But the real survivors had started preparing long before the eruption began. Remember those mysterious, empty stables and missing ships? That wasn't coincidence. The wealthy families who escaped had been quietly liquidating assets and arranging transportation for days, maybe weeks, before October 24th. Here's what they knew that others didn't. In a real catastrophe, there is no official rescue. The Roman government had no emergency evacuation plan for volcanic eruptions because they didn't believe Vesuvius could erupt. Sound familiar? Most modern disaster response relies on the same flawed assumption that authorities will save you. The survivors saved themselves. They had their own boats, their own horses, their own food supplies. When everyone else was standing around waiting for someone to tell them what to do, the prepared families were already miles away. But even more crucial was their understanding of timing. The eruption didn't kill everyone at once. It was a gradual escalation over 18 to 20 hours. The people who survived the first day understood that this was just the beginning. They knew that staying put, even in a seemingly safe shelter, was a death sentence. Archaeological analysis reveals something fascinating about the victims found in Pompeii. The researchers classified them into 2 groups based on where they died in the volcanic layers. The first group, minus 394 people, died during the pumice fall phase. Most of these were people who had taken shelter indoors and were killed when roofs collapsed. The second group, minus 655 people, died during the pyroclastic flow phase the next morning. But here's the revealing detail. Far more of these people were found outdoors. They were trying to escape when the final deadly phase hit. This tells us something crucial. The survivors understood that the first night was just the opening act. While others hunkered down, thinking the worst was over, the smart ones kept moving through the darkness. They also understood something about volcanic eruptions that saved their lives. The danger isn't uniform. Vesuvius was a directed explosion. The deadliest flows went in specific directions based on the volcano's internal structure and the wind patterns. The survivors had somehow figured out the safe corridors. How did they know? Some had connections to people like Pliny the Elder, who was both a scholar and a naval commander. These people had access to information and resources that ordinary citizens didn't. They could see the bigger picture, while others focused only on their immediate surroundings. But perhaps most importantly, they understood the psychology of disaster. They knew that in a crisis, the majority will make the wrong choice simply because it feels more comfortable. Running away from danger feels right, even when it's wrong. Following the crowd feels safe, even when the crowd is heading toward destruction. The survivors were contrarians. They were willing to look foolish, to abandon their possessions, to make hard choices based on incomplete information. They were the people who left their beautiful homes, their businesses, their entire lives behind based on nothing more than a bad feeling and some falling ash dot, and they were right. But their real test was yet to come. As the sun set on October 24th, 79 AD, the survivors who had chosen the northern route thought they might actually make it. They had put distance between themselves and the volcano. They could still breathe relatively clean air, and the worst seemed to be behind them. They were catastrophically wrong. Around 1 a.m. on October 25th, everything changed. The massive column of ash and gas that had been shooting into the sky for 12 hours suddenly became too heavy to sustain itself. 30 kilometers of superheated material began to collapse back down onto the earth. This wasn't a gradual settling. This was a gravitational avalanche of death moving at highway speeds. The first pyroclastic flows hit Herculaneum like a freight train made of fire. The temperature, over 400 degrees Celsius. The speed, between 100 and 700 kilometers per hour. If you were caught in this flow, you didn't burn to death slowly. Your body fluids boiled instantly. Your muscles contracted so violently that people were found in impossible contorted positions. Death was immediate, but it left its mark in the most horrific ways imaginable. The people of Herculaneum had made a fatal miscalculation. When the eruption began, many had fled to what they thought was the safest possible place, the beach. Ancient Roman logic said that if you couldn't go north or south because of the falling debris, you go to the water. Boats could take you to safety. The sea was vast and far from the mountain. Archaeologists found over 300 skeletons huddled in the boathouses along Herculaneum's ancient shoreline. Entire families had gathered there, waiting for rescue ships that would never come. They had no way of knowing that the sea itself had become a trap. Volcanic earthquakes had stirred the waters into such violent turmoil that no ship could safely approach the coast. When the first pyroclastic flow hit Herculaneum, these people had nowhere to run. The volcanic surge didn't just flow over land, it flowed over water too. The superheated gas and ash cloud swept across the bay like a burning tsunami, incinerating everything in its path. But some survivors had anticipated this trap. They had studied the wind patterns more carefully and realized that the coastal areas would become death zones. Instead of heading for the obvious escape route of the sea, they had struck out over land, following ancient roads that led away from the bay entirely. From his villa near Stabia, Pliny the Elder watched columns of fire dance along Vesuvius's slopes throughout that terrible night. To calm his terrified companions, he claimed these were just abandoned villas burning in the countryside. He was lying to keep morale up, but he was also revealing something important, even from a distance. You could see that the entire volcanic region had become uninhabitable. The survivors, who were still moving at this point, had learned to navigate by these distant fires. The glow from the pyroclastic flows actually helped them avoid the most dangerous areas. They could see which valleys were being swept clean by the deadly currents and which ridgelines might offer temporary safety. But their ordeal was far from over. The mountain wasn't finished with them yet. As dawn broke on October 25th, Vesuvius prepared to deliver its final, most devastating blow. The survivors faced a horrible choice: find shelter from what was coming, or keep running and hope they could outpace the mountain's fury. Those who chose wrong would join the thousands already dead. Those who chose correctly would carry their story forward into history. What they didn't know was that this second day would test every survival skill they had learned. Because what was coming wasn't just another pyroclastic flow. It was something far worse. Dawn on October 25th brought no relief. If anything, the violence was escalating. The survivors who had made it through the night faced a new nightmare. Vesuvius was no longer content to throw debris in one direction. It was preparing to unleash pyroclastic flows in all directions. Modern volcanic analysis tells us that at least 6 separate pyroclastic flows would sweep down from the mountain over the next few hours. Each one carried the destructive power of a nuclear blast, traveling at speeds that made escape seem impossible. The temperatures reached 800 degrees Celsius in some flows, hot enough to melt copper. Yet somehow, people were still escaping. How? The key was understanding the geography. Pyroclastic flows, despite their incredible power, follow the laws of physics. They flow like water, following valleys and low-lying areas. The survivors who made it out had instinctively sought higher ground, ridgelines, hilltops, elevated roads that would force the flows to pass beneath them. But elevation alone wasn't enough. These flows could climb uphill if they had enough momentum. Some traveled 20 kilometers from the volcano, overwhelming everything in their path. The successful survivors had to combine height advantage with distance, creating multiple safety margins. Archaeological detective work has revealed exactly how some of these escapes unfolded. In the area around Nuceria, about 30 kilometers north of Vesuvius, researchers found evidence of sudden population growth immediately after 79 AD. New names appear in the local records, names that match family lineages known from Pompeii. The Caltellius family, for instance, successfully escaped to Ostia, the port city north of Rome. Not only did they survive, but they thrived. They intermarried with other survivor families and became wealthy again. Their tombstones, discovered centuries later, tell stories of resilience and renewal. But not all the survival stories ended happily. Fabia Secundina, granddaughter of a wealthy wine merchant from Pompeii, made it to Putelli. But in her new city, she was forced to marry a gladiator who died young, leaving her in poverty. Survival, it turned out, was just the first challenge. Rebuilding your life from nothing was often even harder. The most remarkable survival story belongs to the families who didn't just escape, they helped others escape too. The Attili family took in orphaned children whose parents had died in the eruption. Even in their own desperate circumstances, they chose compassion over self-preservation. But perhaps the most incredible revelation came from recent archaeological work in Pompeii itself. Researchers discovered something that rewrites our entire understanding of the disaster. Some people actually returned to the ruins and tried to restart their lives there. Evidence of post-eruption occupation has been found throughout the buried city. People converted the upper floors of partially buried buildings into makeshift homes. They turned buried ground floors into improvised basements. They created a ramshackle settlement in the ruins of their former city. These weren't looters or temporary scavengers. These were former residents who couldn't afford to start over somewhere else. So they came back to live among the ghosts of their old lives. Imagine the psychological strength required to make that choice, to live in the graveyard of your former world because it was still better than having nothing at all. The evidence suggests this post-eruption settlement lasted for years, maybe decades. It was a precarious existence. No infrastructure, no government services, no safety net. Just people refusing to give up, even in the face of complete devastation. This reveals perhaps the most important survival trait of all: adaptability. The people who lived weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest or the luckiest. They were the ones who could accept that their old world was gone and focus entirely on creating a new one. But there's one more crucial lesson hidden in the archaeological record, and it's about timing. Recent analysis of the volcanic deposits has revealed something extraordinary about the timing of the Pompeii eruption. The window for escape was much longer than anyone previously believed, but it required making the right choices at exactly the right moments. The eruption unfolded in distinct phases, each with its own survival strategies. Phase 1 lasted from 1 p.m. on October 24th until about 1 a.m. on October 25th, 12 full hours of pumice fall. During this phase, escape was not only possible, but relatively straightforward if you knew what to do. The fatal mistake most people made was treating this like a temporary weather event. They took shelter indoors and waited for it to pass. But the survivors understood that this was the evacuation window, not tomorrow, not when things calmed down. Right now, while you could still move, while the roads were still passable, while boats could still navigate. The archaeological evidence shows us exactly what the successful evacuees were doing during these crucial hours. They were traveling light, leaving behind everything except essentials. They were moving in groups for mutual protection and shared resources. And they were following specific routes that avoided the most dangerous areas. One of the most revealing discoveries came from tracking the movement patterns of wealthy families. The Numeria Pompeii family, prominent citizens of Pompeii, had somehow managed to coordinate their escape with multiple other families. They didn't just run randomly, they had an actual evacuation plan. How do we know this? Because researchers found their names appearing together in the same distant cities after the eruption. This wasn't coincidence. This was organized, coordinated survival. While most people were paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of the disaster, these families were treating it like a military retreat. The second phase, beginning around 1 a.m. on October 25th, was when escape became nearly impossible. This was when the pyroclastic flows began. But even then, some people were still making it out. The key was understanding the topography and the flow patterns. Pyroclastic flows behave like deadly rivers. They follow predictable paths down valleys and around obstacles. The late escapees were the ones who could read the landscape and predict where these flows would go before they arrived. But here's the most chilling detail. Some of the victims found in Pompeii were people who had almost made it. They were discovered at the city gates, on the roads leading out, just meters from potential safety. They had figured out the escape strategy, but they had run out of time. This teaches us something vital about disaster psychology. In a crisis, procrastination doesn't just mean delay, it means death. The people who survived Vesuvius were the ones who acted on partial information rather than waiting for complete certainty. Modern disaster experts call this the preparation paradox. The time when you most need to act is also the time when you have the least information. The survivors of Pompeii cracked this paradox by accepting uncertainty and acting anyway. But there's one aspect of survival that most people never consider, and it's perhaps the most important of all. What really separated the survivors from the victims wasn't physical strength or wealth or luck. It was something much more subtle: their relationship with normalcy. Dr. Stephen Tuck, the archaeologist who tracked down the survivors' stories, discovered something fascinating in his research. The people who escaped weren't necessarily the ones you'd expect. They weren't all wealthy, they weren't all young and strong, and they weren't all living close to escape routes. What they had in common was what psychologists now call cognitive flexibility. They could abandon their assumptions when reality changed. Most people, when faced with something unprecedented, try to fit it into familiar categories. It's just a storm. It's just an earthquake. It'll pass like the others did. The survivors looked at the falling ash and said, "I've never seen anything like this before, so I'm going to assume it's as dangerous as it looks." They didn't need to understand volcanic eruptions to recognize mortal danger. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of the Pompeii disaster. Why so many people stayed put even as conditions deteriorated. It wasn't stupidity or ignorance. It was the human brain's desperate attempt to maintain a sense of normal life, even as that life was ending. Consider the timeline. The eruption began at 1 p.m. By 3 p.m., pumice stones were falling steadily. By 6 p.m., the accumulation was becoming serious. By 9 p.m., movement was becoming difficult. Yet people were still going about their daily routines, still trying to protect their property, still believing this would somehow resolve itself. The survivors broke free from this psychological trap through what experts now call pre-commitment. They had already decided, before the crisis hit, what they would sacrifice to save their lives. Their possessions, their homes, their social status. None of it mattered more than survival. This pre-commitment showed up in the archaeological record in remarkable ways. Some families had clearly divided their valuable items into two categories: what to take and what to leave behind. The items they took were portable, valuable, and useful for starting over. The items they left were beautiful but impractical: artwork, furniture, decorative objects. But the most important pre-commitment was emotional. The survivors had somehow prepared themselves to lose everything they knew and start over from nothing. This psychological readiness may have been what saved them when the moment of choice arrived. The victims, in contrast, often died with their treasures. They were found clutching jewelry, coins, precious objects that they couldn't bear to abandon. Their attachment to their former lives had literally weighed them down at the moment when speed meant survival. Modern disaster psychology recognizes this pattern in every major catastrophe. The people who live are often the ones who can cut their losses quickly and completely. They don't look back, they don't second-guess themselves, and they don't try to save things that can't be saved. But there's one more layer to this story that makes it even more remarkable. Some of the Pompeii survivors didn't just escape, they came back. and their return reveals the final, most important survival lesson of all. This is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Months after the eruption, when the ash had settled and the flows had cooled, people began trickling back into the devastated zone. Not looters or scavengers, but actual survivors coming home. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of organized salvage operations in the ruins of Pompeii. These weren't random treasure hunters. These were systematic efforts to recover what could be saved from the buried city. Tools, building materials, anything useful was carefully extracted and repurposed. But some people took this much further. They actually moved back into the ruins and created a new settlement among the graves of their former neighbors. Archaeological evidence shows that parts of Pompeii were reoccupied and inhabited for years, possibly decades after the eruption. This reveals something profound about human resilience. For some people, losing everything isn't the end of the story. It's a terrible new beginning. These returnees had survived the volcano's fury twice, once by escaping it, and again by refusing to let it erase their identity completely. The post-eruption settlement wasn't anything like the original Pompeii. The new residents lived in the upper floors of partially buried buildings, using collapsed ground floors as storage cellars. They had no running water, no sewage system, no government services. It was essentially a shantytown built on top of a grave. Yet, they formed new social networks, established new trade relationships, and created new forms of community organization. Some even prospered. Archaeological evidence suggests that several families who returned to the ruins eventually became wealthy enough to fund construction projects in other cities. This teaches us the final survival lesson. Sometimes the best place to rebuild isn't the safest place. It's the place that still feels like home. These people understood something that modern disaster victims often struggle with. You can lose everything and still have something worth fighting for. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story is how completely it was forgotten. For nearly 2,000 years, we remembered only the victims, the dramatic molds of people frozen in their final moments, the preserved streets and houses, the tragedy of a civilization stopped in time. We forgot about the ones who refused to be stopped, the ones who ran toward safety, while others ran toward danger, the ones who abandoned everything to save their lives, then slowly, patiently rebuilt from nothing, the ones who came back to dance on the grave of the mountain that tried to kill them. Their stories were buried not by volcanic ash, but by our fascination with disaster rather than recovery. We preferred the dramatic finality of destruction to the messy, complicated reality of survival. But now their stories are emerging from the archaeological record, and they're teaching us things that could save lives today. Because while we can't predict exactly when the next volcanic eruption will occur, we can learn from the people who survived the most famous one in history. The survival strategies that worked in 79 AD aren't just historical curiosities. They're blueprints for surviving any major disaster. Let me break down the essential lessons that could save your life today. First, trust your instincts over conventional wisdom. The Pompeii survivors didn't wait for official evacuation orders that never came. They didn't follow the crowd to seemingly safe locations that turned out to be death traps. They made their own assessments and acted on them immediately. Modern disaster research confirms this repeatedly. In hurricanes, earthquakes, terrorist attacks, and other catastrophes, the people who survive are often the ones who ignore official advice and trust their own judgment, not because authorities are incompetent, but because disasters unfold faster than bureaucracies can respond. Second, prepare to lose everything except your life. The survivors of Vesuvius had mentally prepared themselves to abandon their possessions, their social status, even their identity if necessary. They understood that in a true catastrophe, everything is negotiable except survival itself. This sounds obvious, but it's incredibly hard to do in practice. Most disaster victims waste precious time trying to save things that can be replaced. They go back for photo albums, important documents, valuable items. Meanwhile, the window for escape is closing. Third, understand that disasters have multiple phases, and the first phase is usually not the deadliest. The pumice fall that began the Vesuvius eruption was dramatic and frightening, but it didn't kill most people directly. The pyroclastic flows that came later were what caused the mass casualties. Modern volcanologists see this pattern repeatedly. The initial explosion gets all the attention, but the secondary effects are what kill. Tsunamis after earthquakes, fires after gas line ruptures, infrastructure collapse after the primary event has ended. The survivors understood that getting through the first crisis only earned them the right to face the second crisis. They stayed alert, stayed mobile, and stayed ready to adapt their strategy as conditions changed. Fourth, information is survival currency. The people who escaped Vesuvius weren't just lucky, they were informed. They had connections to people like Pliny the Elder who understood natural phenomena. They had access to resources and knowledge that ordinary citizens didn't. In any modern disaster, information asymmetry kills. The people with better communication tools, better understanding of the threats, and better access to resources have dramatically higher survival rates. This isn't fair, but it's reality. Fifth, social networks save lives. The survivors didn't escape alone. They escaped in coordinated groups. Families helped families. Wealthy citizens hired boats that took multiple households to safety. Communities formed mutual aid networks that persisted for decades after the disaster. Modern disaster research shows the same pattern. In Hurricane Katrina, the 2004 tsunami, and countless other catastrophes, survival often comes down to being part of a group that can pool resources and share risks. But here's the most important lesson. Survival requires accepting that your old world is gone forever. The people who kept trying to preserve their previous lives, who couldn't accept that everything had changed, were the ones who died. The survivors were the ones who could mourn their losses while simultaneously building something new. This is perhaps the hardest survival skill of all, the ability to let go completely when letting go is the only way to live. The Pompeii survivors mastered this skill under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. While thousands fled in terror, a few remarkable individuals ran toward the danger. Their stories reveal another crucial survival principle. Sometimes the best way to save yourself is to save others first. Pliny the Elder's rescue mission is the most famous, but it wasn't the only one. Archaeological evidence suggests that several other Roman officials launched similar operations. At Herculaneum, researchers discovered the remains of what appears to be a Praetorian Guard soldier, one of Rome's elite troops, who died while attempting to evacuate civilians. These rescue attempts failed, but they reveal something important about disaster dynamics. The people who organized rescue missions weren't just being heroic, they were following a survival strategy that often works: gather intelligence, maintain mobility, and use your resources to help others while helping yourself. Pliny the Elder's mission provides a perfect case study in both the promise and the peril of this approach. When he received Rectina's plea for help, he immediately mobilized Roman naval vessels. His plan was brilliant in theory. Approach by sea to avoid the volcanic debris falling on land routes. Evacuate as many people as possible, and gather first-hand information about the eruption's behavior. The plan failed because he underestimated the secondary effects. The volcanic earthquakes made sea evacuation impossible. The toxic gases killed him before the flows even reached his location. But his mission saved Pliny the Younger's life by keeping him safely away in Misenum, and it provided the detailed observations that became our primary source for understanding the eruption. Modern disaster response teams study Pliny's mission because it illustrates both the potential and the limits of rescue operations during extreme events. Sometimes the infrastructure you're counting on, in this case, Roman naval superiority, becomes useless when nature changes the rules completely. But here's what's fascinating. While the official rescue missions were failing, informal rescue networks were succeeding. The survivors who made it out often did so by joining spontaneous groups of escapees who shared resources and information. Archaeological evidence from the escape routes shows signs of organized movement. Groups of people traveling together, sharing carts and pack animals, coordinating their rest stops. These weren't random refugees. These were communities in motion, maintaining social bonds even as their physical world collapsed. The most successful of these groups seemed to understand something crucial about disaster psychology. Panic kills, but purpose saves. Instead of fleeing in terror, they were evacuating with intention. They had destinations in mind, people to contact when they arrived, plans for what to do next. This explains why so many survivors ended up in specific cities rather than being scattered randomly across the Roman Empire. They weren't just running away from Vesuvius. They were running toward new lives they had already begun to plan. But the rescue story that haunts me the most is the one that never happened. The most heartbreaking aspect of the Pompeii disaster isn't the scale of the destruction, it's how close so many people came to surviving. Archaeological analysis reveals that hundreds of victims were found just meters away from potential safety, killed not by the volcano directly, but by the collapse of the very structures they thought would protect them. The villa of Papyri at Herculaneum tells this story perfectly. When the eruption began, the wealthy owner opened his home to neighbors seeking shelter. The villa was massive, well-built, and seemed far enough from the volcano to be safe. Dozens of people crowded into its rooms, convinced they had found sanctuary. They were all killed when the first pyroclastic flow hit. The villa's stone walls, which seemed so solid and protective, became an oven when superheated gas filled the rooms. The people who had sought shelter became victims of what volcanologists now call edifice trap syndrome. Death caused by trusting human construction over natural forces. The survivors had somehow understood that in an event of this magnitude, no building was safe. They chose the uncertainty of open ground over the false security of shelter. This wasn't luck. This was a fundamental difference in how they assessed risk. But the most tragic cases were the families who were divided by these different survival philosophies. Archaeological evidence suggests that in several households, some family members chose to flee, while others chose to shelter in place. The evacuation records show names of people who survived, but who lost spouses, children, or parents who made different choices. Imagine the survivor's guilt of escaping while your loved ones perished because you couldn't convince them to run. Several tombstones from the decades following the eruption contain inscriptions that seem to reference this exact tragedy. Survivors mourning family members who chose to stay when the mountain spoke. This reveals perhaps the cruelest aspect of disaster survival. It often requires making choices that tear families apart. The people who insisted on keeping their families together often doomed everyone. The people who were willing to accept separation were more likely to have family members who lived. Modern disaster psychology recognizes this as one of the most difficult decisions any person can face. Do you force your family to flee when they don't want to go? Do you leave without them if they refuse to come? Do you stay and risk everyone's lives to maintain family unity? The Pompeii survivors chose life over unity. They made the hard choice to split up, believing they could reunite later in safety. Sometimes this worked. Families were reunited in distant cities weeks or months after the eruption. Sometimes it didn't, and the survivors carried that grief for the rest of their lives. But there's one more twist to this story that changes everything we thought we knew about the eruption. For centuries, historians believed the Vesuvius eruption occurred on August 24, 79 AD. This date came from copies of Pliny the Younger's letters to Tacitus. But modern archaeology has uncovered evidence that completely contradicts this traditional timeline. The eruption actually happened in October, probably October 24th. How do we know? Because of what the victims were wearing and eating when they died. Bodies found in Pompeii were dressed in heavier clothing, wool cloaks, and winter garments that would have been unnecessarily warm in August. The food remains found in shops and homes include autumn fruits like figs, pomegranates, and olives, along with evidence of winemaking activities that only occurred in October. But this timing revelation changes everything about survival strategy. An October eruption meant the weather was cooler, the daylight hours were shorter, and the seasonal wind patterns were different from what we previously believed. The survivors who fled north weren't just avoiding the ash cloud. They were traveling during the most favorable weather conditions possible for a long-distance escape. October temperatures made it possible to travel during daylight hours without overheating, and the shorter days meant that the dangerous volcanic activity was more visible against the dark sky. This timing also explains why the escape routes to the north were so successful. October was the season when Roman roads were in their best condition, dry enough for fast travel, but not yet damaged by winter weather. The survivors were essentially escaping during the optimal travel season. But the October timing reveals something even more significant about the survivors' decision-making. They weren't just reacting to an unexpected disaster. They were dealing with something that had been building for weeks during the harvest season. Recent archaeological work has found evidence of increased seismic activity throughout September and early October. Wells had been failing, springs had been drying up, and there had been minor ash falls for days before the main eruption. The people who survived had been reading these subtle signals and preparing for something big. This suggests that survival wasn't just about making good decisions during the crisis itself. It was about recognizing the crisis before it fully developed. The survivors were the people who had been quietly worried for weeks, who had been making small preparations, who had been positioning themselves for a quick exit. While most citizens were focused on the harvest season and the normal rhythms of Roman life, The future survivors were watching the mountain and trusting their growing sense of unease. But there's one final revelation about these survivors that's perhaps the most important of all. The most recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that survival wasn't just an individual achievement, it was a collective one. The people who escaped Vesuvius were part of informal networks that shared information, resources, and coordinated their escape efforts. Dr. Stephen Tuck's detective work has uncovered evidence of what can only be described as ancient disaster preparedness communities. Wealthy families in different cities around the Bay of Naples had apparently established mutual aid agreements long before the eruption occurred. The Avioli family from Pompeii, for example, had connections with families in Nuceria who took them in immediately after the disaster. This wasn't charity offered to strangers. This was a pre-existing relationship that activated during the crisis. The families had already agreed to help each other if disaster struck. These networks explain how so many survivors managed to not just escape, but to successfully integrate into new communities. They arrived with introductions, recommendations, and sometimes even business partnerships already arranged, while other refugees struggled to find acceptance in strange cities. The networked survivors stepped into established social positions. The archaeological evidence suggests these networks were surprisingly extensive. Names of Pompeii survivors appear in inscriptions across at least 12 different cities, but they're not randomly distributed. They cluster in specific locations where other survivors had also settled, creating new communities of people bound together by their shared trauma and mutual support. This isn't just ancient history, it's a survival strategy that works in modern disasters too. Hurricane Katrina survivors who had established relationships in other cities before the storm were far more likely to successfully relocate than those who tried to start from scratch. The same pattern appears in wildfire evacuations, earthquake responses, and pandemic relocations. But the Vesuvius networks went beyond just mutual aid. They also included information sharing that may have been crucial for survival timing. Wealthy Romans had extensive correspondence networks that could rapidly communicate news across long distances. A warning sent from Vesuvius could reach Rome in a matter of days, and from there spread throughout the empire. Some of the survivors may have received advance warning through these networks. A message like strange activity on the mountain, consider leaving early, could have provided the crucial head start that made escape possible. This explains why so many of the successful evacuees were from wealthy families. It wasn't just that they had more resources for travel, they had better access to information that allowed them to recognize the danger before it became obvious to everyone else. The networks also explain the most puzzling aspect of the survivor distribution. Why so many ended up in cities north of Vesuvius rather than south. The southern routes may have looked safer, but the northern cities were where their contacts lived. The survivors followed their social connections rather than just geographical logic. This teaches us something vital about modern disaster preparedness. Your survival network is more important than your survival kit. Having people in safe locations who will take you in, help you find work, and support your recovery is worth more than any amount of emergency supplies. But there's one final aspect of the Pompeii survival story that ties everything together. Let's return to that crucial moment at 1 p.m. on October 24th when the mountain exploded and everyone in Pompeii had to make an instant choice. Recent volcanic research has revealed exactly why some choices led to survival, while others led to death. The key was understanding the difference between volcanic hazards and volcanic risks. A hazard is what the volcano can do: produce ash clouds, pyroclastic flows, toxic gases. A risk is what those hazards mean for you specifically, based on where you are and what you do next. The people who died were focused on the hazards. They saw the massive explosion and focused on getting as far away as possible from the source of danger. This seems logical, but it ignored the actual risk pattern of how volcanic debris would spread. The survivors focused on risks. They looked at the wind direction, assessed which routes would be blocked by falling debris, and calculated where the secondary effects would be most dangerous. They didn't just run from the volcano, they ran to safety, and those are very different things. Modern volcanic research has revealed exactly how this played out in scientific terms. The pumice fall from Vesuvius followed a precise southeastern trajectory determined by upper atmosphere wind patterns. Anyone fleeing south or southeast was running directly into the heaviest concentration of falling debris. The northbound survivors were essentially running parallel to the danger zone rather than away from it. This kept them in relatively clear air while still allowing them to put distance between themselves and the volcano. It was a more complex strategy, but it was based on observing the actual pattern of the eruption, rather than just the emotional impulse to flee. But the real genius of the survivors becomes clear when we analyze the pyroclastic flow patterns from the second day. These flows followed the topographical valleys leading south and west from Vesuvius. The people who had fled north weren't just avoiding the initial ashfall. They had unknowingly positioned themselves outside the paths that the deadliest volcanic flows would follow. Did they understand the science of pyroclastic flows? Of course not. But they understood enough about how landscapes channel moving water to apply that knowledge to moving volcanic debris. They treated the flows like flash floods and sought high ground accordingly. This reveals something profound about survival intelligence. You don't need to understand the technical details of a disaster to survive it. You need to understand patterns, recognize analogies, and apply knowledge from familiar situations to unfamiliar ones. The Pompeii survivors were using the same cognitive skills that hunters use to track animals or sailors use to navigate by stars. They were reading the landscape, the weather, and the behavior of the disaster itself, then making educated guesses about what would happen next. Modern neuroscience research shows that this kind of pattern recognition operates much faster than conscious analysis. The survivors may have made their crucial decisions based on intuitive assessments that felt right, even when they couldn't explain why. This explains why survival often comes down to trusting your gut rather than overthinking the situation. In a rapidly evolving disaster, the people who pause to analyze every detail often run out of time to act. The people who recognize the pattern and move immediately are the ones who live. But there's one final lesson hidden in the Vesuvius story, and it's about something even more fundamental than survival technique. 25 years after the eruption, Pliny the Younger sat down to write his famous letters to Tacitus about that terrible day, as he recalled the events that had killed his uncle and changed his world forever. He was also documenting something remarkable: how survivors rebuild not just their lives, but their understanding of life itself. The people who escaped Vesuvius didn't just survive a volcanic eruption, they survived the complete destruction of their worldview. Romans in 79 AD believed they understood how the world worked. Volcanoes were either active or extinct, and extinct ones stayed extinct. The Earth was stable except for occasional earthquakes. The future was predictable based on the past. Vesuvius shattered every one of these assumptions. The survivors had to construct entirely new frameworks for understanding reality. They had to accept that the impossible could happen, that nature was far more powerful than human civilization, and that safety was always provisional. This psychological transformation may have been their greatest survival tool. The people who could adapt their mental models to match the new reality were better equipped to handle the ongoing challenges of being disaster refugees in an ancient world without modern support systems. The survivor communities that formed after the eruption developed what we might now call trauma-informed social structures. They understood that everyone was carrying psychological wounds alongside their physical losses. The family networks that took in orphans weren't just being charitable, they were recognizing that community. Healing required taking care of the most vulnerable. Archaeological evidence from Nuceria, where many survivors settled, shows something remarkable. These communities invested heavily in religious and civic infrastructure. They built temples, sponsored public games, and contributed to community projects at rates higher than typical for their economic status. This wasn't just civic duty, it was survival strategy. The survivors understood that their safety depended on being fully integrated into their new communities. They couldn't afford to be seen as outsiders or refugees indefinitely. They had to become indispensable members of their new societies. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of survivor psychology was their relationship with risk. Having survived one impossible disaster, they didn't become paralyzed by fear of the next one. Instead, they became incredibly sophisticated risk assessors. Survivor families from Vesuvius can be traced through Roman records for several generations, and their behavior patterns are remarkably consistent. They diversified their holdings across multiple locations. They maintained escape plans and emergency resources. They built relationships with people in distant cities. They had learned that survival requires constant preparation, not just crisis response. In essence, they had become the ancient world's first disaster preparedness experts. Their hard-won knowledge was passed down through their families and social networks, creating communities that were unusually resilient to future catastrophes. This legacy explains something that has puzzled historians for centuries. Why some Roman communities seemed so much better at surviving subsequent disasters than others. The answer may be that they were led by families who had inherited survival wisdom from the Vesuvius escapees. But there's one final twist to this story that brings everything full circle. Today, Mount Vesuvius is quiet. It hasn't erupted since 1944, and it's surrounded by over 3 million people living in what volcanologists politely call the red zone. Naples, one of Italy's largest cities, sits in the shadow of the mountain that destroyed Pompeii. The coastal areas where ancient Roman villas once stood are now covered with modern apartment buildings, schools, and hospitals. The Italian government has emergency plans for evacuating this population if Vesuvius shows signs of reawakening. These plans assume they'll have weeks or months of warning before an eruption occurs. They assume that modern transportation networks will function normally during a crisis. They assume that 3 million people can be moved in an orderly fashion. The survivors of 79 AD would recognize these assumptions as dangerously optimistic. Modern volcanological monitoring is incredibly sophisticated compared to ancient Rome's complete ignorance of volcanic science. We have seismometers that can detect the tiniest ground movements, gas sensors that can identify chemical changes in volcanic emissions, and satellite imagery that can track ground deformation in real time. But all of this technology still can't answer the most important question. Exactly when will the next eruption begin? We can detect when a volcano is becoming more active, but we can't predict the precise moment when activity becomes eruption. That transition can happen in minutes or hours, far faster than any evacuation plan can respond. The Vesuvius survivors of 79 AD survived because they didn't wait for official warnings or evacuation orders. They acted on their own assessment of increasing danger. In a modern Vesuvius eruption, the people who survive will likely be the ones who make the same choice: leave early based on their own judgment, rather than waiting for authorities to tell them when it's time to go. This isn't just relevant for volcanic disasters. Hurricane Katrina, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In every case, the people who survived were often the ones who evacuated before they were told to evacuate. The ancient survivors also teach us something crucial about disaster recovery. They didn't just escape the immediate danger. They built new lives that were more resilient than their old ones. They created support networks, diversified their resources, and maintained constant awareness of potential future threats. In our modern world, where climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, these ancient survival strategies are more relevant than ever. The descendants of the Vesuvius survivors carried forward a culture of preparedness that helped them weather future catastrophes. We could learn from their example, not just about how to escape disasters, but about how to build societies that can absorb catastrophic shocks and emerge stronger. But there's one last lesson that ties all of these survival strategies together, and it's the most important one of all. After analyzing thousands of archaeological records, interviewing modern volcanologists, and tracing the life stories of ancient survivors, one pattern emerges above all others. The people who survived Vesuvius shared one crucial characteristic that had nothing to do with wealth, location, or physical capability. They were all people who had already survived something else. The wealthy villa owners who fled early. Many of them had lived through the earthquake of 62 AD and learned not to trust that disasters were temporary. The families who had established evacuation networks, they often included veterans of military campaigns who understood logistics and coordination under pressure. The communities that successfully integrated refugees, they were often led by people who had themselves been displaced by earlier conflicts. This reveals the most important survival secret of all. Resilience is a skill that develops through experience, and the best preparation for surviving the next disaster is learning from the last one. The people who died in Pompeii weren't less intelligent or less capable than those who survived. They were people who had lived comfortable, stable lives and had never been forced to develop crisis response capabilities. When the unprecedented happened, they had no mental framework for dealing with it. The survivors were people who had already learned that life could change instantly and completely. They had already faced moments when everything they knew was wrong and everything they planned was useless. They had already practiced the psychological flexibility that disaster survival requires. This explains why modern disaster research consistently shows that people with military experience, people who have lived through previous emergencies, and people from unstable regions often have higher survival rates in catastrophic events. It's not that they're braver or stronger, it's that they've already learned to think like survivors. But here's what's truly remarkable. You can develop this mindset without waiting for a disaster to teach you. The Vesuvius survivors weren't just lucky. They were people who had chosen to learn from other people's disasters before experiencing their own. They had listened to stories from older generations about wars, famines, earthquakes, and floods. They had absorbed the lessons of previous catastrophes and applied them when their own crisis arrived. They had developed what we might now call inherited resilience, the ability to benefit from survival experiences they had never personally lived through. This is why studying disasters like Pompeii isn't just academic curiosity, it's practical preparation. Every survival story contains patterns that repeat in different disasters across different time periods. The specific details change, but the underlying principles of human behavior under extreme stress remain remarkably consistent. The people who escaped the Vesuvius eruption weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who had learned extraordinary survival skills from the stories and experiences of others. They prove that survival wisdom can be transmitted across generations, and that learning from history isn't just educational, it's potentially life-saving. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most devastating natural disasters, let's remember what we've learned from the people who refused to become victims. The Vesuvius survivors teach us that disaster preparedness isn't about stockpiling supplies or memorizing evacuation routes. Though those things matter, it's about developing a survival mindset that allows you to act decisively, when acting decisively is the difference between life and death. They teach us that survival often requires doing the counterintuitive thing, running toward apparent danger to avoid real danger, abandoning valuable possessions to preserve something more valuable, leaving loved ones behind to save them from making fatal mistakes. They teach us that the people who survive disasters aren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest or the luckiest. They're the people who can abandon their assumptions when reality changes, who can cut their losses completely when cutting losses is the only way forward, and who can maintain hope and purpose even when their entire world has been destroyed. Most importantly, they teach us that survival stories don't end with escape. The real challenge begins after you've survived the immediate crisis. How do you rebuild your life from nothing? How do you form new communities with other survivors? How do you pass along your survival knowledge to the next generation? The answers to these questions are written in the archaeological record of the people who escaped Vesuvius and went on to live full, productive lives in distant cities. They proved that even the most devastating disasters can't destroy human resilience, creativity, and the fundamental drive to not just survive, but to thrive. Their names were forgotten by history for nearly 2,000 years, but their strategies, their wisdom, and their refusal to give up have echoes that reach across the centuries. In every modern disaster, in every community that rebuilds after catastrophic loss, in every family that finds a way forward after losing everything, the spirit of the Vesuvius survivors lives on. The mountain tried to erase them from history, but history, as it turns out, is written by those who refuse to be erased. So, the next time you face your own moment of crisis, whether it's a natural disaster, a personal catastrophe, or just a situation where everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong, remember the people who looked at an exploding volcano and decided to run toward tomorrow instead of away from today. They survived the impossible. And their story proves that impossible survival is possible if you know what they knew, and if you're willing to do what they did. The volcano is quiet now, but the lessons remain, waiting for anyone wise enough to learn them. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful form of survival of all. The survival of knowledge itself, passed down through the ages to help the next generation face their own impossible moments. Because, in the end, we all live in the shadow of some volcano. The question isn't whether the mountain will wake up again. The question is, when it does, will you be ready?